Hello and welcome to Chester Artbeat, and today we are going to be interviewing Alex Russell. Now, some of you may have met Alex Russell in 2022 at Chester Artbeat. This is his second time, as you might have seen in the information. And Alex is an artist who lives and works in Manchester. He's been working as an artist since January 2022, creating generative prints by assembling libraries of handmade images into one-off artworks. Now, he writes computer programs with code which combine models of composition and colour, which comes from art and design, with complex systems from science and maths, and he takes the rich history of printmaking to a unique place, exploring the craft possibilities of new media. And it's worth noting, Alex does not use AI. So prior to this, Alex was a printed textile surface pattern designer and lecturer, and he sold to an international client list, and his work features widely in books about printed textiles. As a lecturer, Alex taught under and postgraduates for nearly 20 years, and his book, The Fundamentals of Printed Textile Design, is in its second edition and has been translated into French and Spanish in addition. So he is shown in a wide range of venues, which include Lightbox in New York, the Browerby Cultural Centre, the Forum Gallery in Poland, FACT Liverpool, UK, the Waterside in Sale, UK, Left Bank in Leeds, Story House in Chester, and the Frontier Gallery in Sheffield, all in the UK. And he's participated at numerous art, print and craft fairs, including the Great Northern Contemporary Craft Fair and the National Festival of Making, and not to mention ourselves, Chester Artbeat. So it is a pleasure to welcome you, Alex. Let me bring you to the stage. Hello.
Hello.
So great to have you here.
Nice to be with you.
And I see that you are in your studio with all of your colourful prints in the background. Yes,
that's right. Yes, I've had a tidy up, and yes, I've got a few examples of prints around here. The other stuff you can see is development work, and I have got some prints in front of me that I can hold up at key moments as well during the course of today.
You have come with props. We have digital props too as well. So just let me know as and when if there's anything you would like me to share on the digital side. Okay. And I'm aware that, as you say, the development process, part of your process is in some ways quite unique as you pull on the fields of art and science and maths. So I'd love you to just start by explaining to our viewers, because if they're like me, when you first mentioned this to me, I had no clue about what you were going on about. So let's have the Dummy's Guide to Generative Coding to Create Art.
Okay. So what I do is I start the process with two different things. I make libraries of images by hand. So if I've got some examples here just to show you. So these are really simple, just squares of tissue paper that I've in some cases painted stripes on. Sometimes it might be something like this, which is a more detailed drawing of a flower, but it's always handmade stuff. And then what I do is I scan everything in so that I've got a big library of images to work with, and I write a computer program that arranges all of that library of stuff into unique one-off prints. So every time the code runs, it creates a new one-off print. And the way what the code does essentially is it's a compositional thing, so it's arranging the scans into some sort of picture. But there are kind of underlying rules, and those rules come from partly art and design, but also from science. If you bring up the first development slide, if that's possible.
Of course, it is. Let me grab that now for you. So we have some here. So process one would be this one. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes. So this is the top bit of the image is a page from my sketchbook, which looks very mathematical, and it is me essentially working with a grid, working out where I want the images to be in that space, and that the grey and black and white image underneath is the is the code, or just a kind of dry run of the code starting to work. So in this case, what it's doing is I've divided the image space up into a grid, and for each square of the grid, it's looking at its neighbours, and how it behaves, how that particular square does something, is dependent on what the neighbours are doing. So if, for example, an area of the image is getting very crowded, there's lots of images already in the neighbourhood, there's less likelihood of an image going there. And this is a scientific concept or a scientific idea called cellular automata, which I use a lot in my work. So essentially what it means is that I can control how busy or how quiet an area of the image is, dependent on what's already going on around it.
Which obviously makes a big impact on visual art, doesn't it? The way that our eyes read images, bright spots and dark spots, the way that we are programmed culturally to read left to right, top to bottom, at least in the West, and then where the eye goes according to busyness and contrast, is huge. So when you're not generating the artwork yourself, I suppose writing these rules in has been rather key. Did you understand that right from the get-go when you first started coding for this sort of artwork, or is it something that you've learnt and developed as you've progressed?
It's a bit of both, to be honest, Elizabeth. When I was working as a textile designer, I kind of noticed that there were particular things I was doing again and again and again, whatever the imagery I was using. So whether I was doing a floral or whether I was doing an abstract textile design, the way that I was putting the image together was essentially very similar. There were kind of underlying rules, and a lot of that is to do with allowing the eye to move freely around the picture, not letting it get caught in one area. So there were definite ideas I brought in, but as my coding skills have developed, what I'm finding now is I'm kind of finding other ways of doing things that have grown out of my knowledge of coding. So just to give an example, I'm starting to use the coding more and more to do the color within the images, and I'm getting the hang of being able to work with a specific color palette, say, but without allowing any color to dominate or kind of overdo what's going on. So it's a mixture of both.
Okay. And would any of these images here be ones that suggest that you just talked about the color aspect? Would any of them be good examples of that? Or
yes, if you go to the image, it's number 7 on your list. So all the scans in the library for this series are black and white. So I've got a friend who's got a Riso printer, and he let me loose on it one day and was very patient when I did all sorts of things with it you're not supposed to do, like put paper back into it and all kinds of things. But what I ended up with was a big collection of black and white images.
okay.
And I was really interested in making prints from prints. But clearly all the work I had to work with was just in black and white. So in this case, there is a color system that the code applies to it. So it for example, there are little flashes of bright colors, a couple of bits of yellow, and you can see in the image, but it doesn't allow too much bright color to happen. It's not going to get swamped by brighter colors. So there's a lot of darker areas with little kind of flashes or accents of color in there.
Yeah, so like up here, I'm noticing there's like flashes of pink and a little bit of green, but on the whole, this upper block is very dark.
Yes.
Whereas it's very much kept the really bright bit almost in a square, to be fair.
Yes. Yeah. So there'll be in some cases, and with this one, if an area starts to get brighter or lighter, it will favour similar things happening to that. So it will go on getting brighter or lighter in that area. And areas that started out dark will remain darker as well. So sometimes it balances and sometimes it exaggerates it.
Okay. And so one of the things that you've mentioned about this whole process is that every print it makes when it runs the code is unique.
Yes.
And obviously it can run it multiple times.
Yep.
So how do you go about selecting, these are the images that I'm going to keep? Like, how many iterations would you, generally speaking, create, and how many of them would you think you keep?
Okay, that's a good question. My aim with all of the series I work in is that every image that the code makes is going to be a goodie. It doesn't unfortunately work that way. There are some series that pretty much always give an image that I'm pleased with. If you maybe go to slide 8, so this is a series I did last year, which is based around the idea of old manuscripts. And in this case, the library is hundreds of little bits of paper and hand-drawn marks, and it's placing abstract writing, asemic writing over the top of them. And I was inspired with this one by the idea of a palimpsest, which is an old-fashioned manuscript. In the past, before paper was widely used, manuscript parchment was so expensive that it was recycled by scraping it clean, but you can sometimes see little traces of the writing underneath. And I was really fascinated by the idea of this.
A bit like when we go to somewhere that's like a cafe and you can see writing embedded in the wood still, just faintly, but he's pressed too hard. Yeah.
Yes. So, but with this particular series, it pretty much always I get a result that I like. So the code, I've managed to find a sweet spot with everything that's going on. That almost always the outputs for this one are kind of past the test, or however you want to describe it. And that's always the goal. There are some series that there's just so much going on that sometimes it is a little bit more tricky, and it sometimes I do find it quite difficult. If perhaps you go to slide number 5.
I did wonder, because there's flowers and so forth in this one.
So this is unusual for me, and this is the only series of mine that's got photography in it. Although quite a lot of the photography is actually film photography or Polaroid photography. But this is probably one of the most complicated series I've done code-wise. And what I found is that if I eliminated all accident from it, I would get kind of fairly averagely good results. But if I let more accidents happen, I get more images that I didn't like, but a few that I really, really like. So I've kind of got the payoff here of maybe only kind of 20-25% of the images come out in a way that I'm happy with, but they're better than if I limit the amount of accident, if that makes sense. So
when you say accident, what do you mean by limiting accident or eliminating it?
So with everything I do, there is an element of randomness in there. I'm defining the limits of the randomness, but there is an element of chance. One of the definitions of generative art is it's art that is autonomous. I set it up, and then once it's going, it kind of runs itself. It's using the rules to build the artwork up. And there is a degree of randomness on this, which image might be picked from the image library, where it might be put, how big it might be, and so on. They're all controlled, the limits of that randomness, but that allows accident to happen in a hopefully in a good and exciting way. And sometimes it's harder to fine tune that than it is in other instances.
Yeah, I can see that one of the things that very much stands out to me about this image compared to the others is, although there's still a grid and block system behind it, you've got curvature, you have this circle with lines going through it, and obviously the edges of the flowers, the shape of them is it's very non-linear, whereas even though you've got the script on this, there's still that element of block and line behind it. And the other images that we looked at, it is that sort of almost like graph paper and grid structure. So I can see why they would be more controllable and consistently give you good results compared to something where overlapping of different shape and form and texture, in addition to the colour and the content, is going to cause additional levels of complexity, I imagine, besides anything else.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yes.
Okay. So part of your process, when we've gone from here, and you work through, so if you were to to start, you said you create like your tissue paper squares. Would that be something quite simple as this one's sort of almost showcasing the textures?
That's exactly it. So these are a lot of the image libraries. They're huge. There might be thousands of images in them, but often they're very simple. And one of the concepts I'm interested in from science is the idea of complexity. So if you have something like a colony of ants, individually, the ants aren't capable of making particularly sophisticated decisions, but when they work as a colony, they can do really clever stuff working together. And this idea of taking simple content and making something very rich and complex out of it is something that runs through a lot of my work. Yes, and so that it's another example of sort of an idea I've got from science that has fed directly into the way that I work.
It's interesting that you came from that textile field,
yes,
and have come into art through lecturing, because I don't know, a lot of creatives, and even conversations I've had myself, there's the creative and more art-based and exploratory side, which obviously science is exploratory, but it's more logical. And we talk about having a creative side to the brain and a logical side to the brain, but the fusion of those two, would you say that that's an influence or sort of an interest of yours that has come from childhood, or it's something that you've become more aware of as you've progressed?
No, I've always been really interested in science. Ever since I was a kid, I was kind of when I was at school, I was really interested in science, and I actually started my education. I originally began a degree in engineering. I got 2 terms in and realised I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do art instead. But the whole way when I did my MA, I got really interested in chaos theory, and that fed into my work. Chaos theory is essentially trying to make sense of very complicated events, and understanding that often it's very simple actions that have a bearing on very complicated things. The classic example is a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon, and a week later the stock market in Tokyo crashes or something. That little bits have a big impact on the world around them, and it's something that I think, I'm just always been interested in. I read a lot of what I call popular science books, but in some cases it's more the ideas behind it. I'm very interested in memory and how the brain forms memories. So some of my work is exploring ideas around that, but in quite an abstract way. Whereas the maths, say, within the way a lot of my code works, draws absolutely directly on, say, complexity or cellular automata or things like that. So it's a mix of both, but I've always been interested in both art and science. And I started coding when I was kind of a teenager. I'm in the generation that kind of was, I suppose, had the first easy access to computers and was able to start playing with them. So I started coding when I was about 14 or 15. And I haven't always coded, but it's kind of been there, and it's had a big influence, I suppose, on the way I think about things. And what I think is really, for me, really interesting about it, that there is this kind of perception that science is all about kind of order and working through things systematically, but actually you can generate as much chaos and as much complexity using scientific formula as you can by kind of chucking paper around or throwing paint at things. And I really like that. I like that there's that scope for making something that's bigger than the sum of its parts, I guess.
Yes, yeah. So as a result, part of your process in your generating, you then said that the next image in the process was
yes, yeah,
it was this one.
So this is me kind of fine tuning the process. So the top half of the image there is really simple blocks just of color, so I can kind of start to get a sense of what's happening in the composition. And then in the bottom half of the image, I'm actually now starting to feed in just a few very simple images. So I've got plain blocks of color as well, the kind of yellow squares you can see there. But the stripy ones are the tissue paper coming in. all the lines mark the edge of boundaries. So I'm just starting to kind of test and try out different ideas. I spend a lot of the time just tweaking things, slightly changing parameters, in some cases to try and fine tune it. I suppose it's a bit like tuning an instrument. I'm kind of trying to get the pitch right. But other times I'll deliberately try quite chaotic or random things just to see if it gives a more interesting idea. But this image is kind of halfway between it being just really simple grids and lines and starting to feed more content in. And if you jump onto process 4 now, so this now is me starting to, this is the getting towards the real fine-tuning bit now. So I'm just playing around now only with library images, but just starting to kind of see how it all looks, maybe kind of playing around with the number of layers, the number of colors. I think in the top image the composition was starting to work, but the colors were coming out quite muddy. There was too much transparency involved, and it was kind of the equivalent of sort of sludgy paint water. Whereas the bottom image is I'm getting close to the result I want, where the colors are singing out, but I've still got that layering effect. And as I said, typically this fine-tuning process is at least half of the time I spend developing each series. So I work in series. Each series has its own code, its own library, and that fine-tuning process at the end is a really big part of it.
Okay, so when you say you're fine-tuning it, this is going back and reworking the code, is it, for example?
Yes, and often just changing. So I might be changing the upper and lower limits of randomness. So just to give an example, there might be a bit of code that makes an image partly transparent, and I decide just how transparent that can be. Should it be something that's, say, almost invisible, or should it be something that's almost completely opaque? So that's the sort of thing I'm just tweaking.
So a bit like you said, this top image, there was a lot of transparency in each image. You could see through it, and it left it a bit muddy. So you made them a little bit more solid here. So that was changing the transparency as well as the vibrancy and other parameters.
Yes.
Okay. So generally speaking, when you are creating a series, what's your process in terms of like actually taking it from idea and conceptualization to actuality? Do you start with a concept of how it's going to look outputted through the code, or do you just start with creating, like up there on the top right of your screen, on the wall above your radiator, you seem to have their physical creations?
Yes, yeah. So this is a new series I'm working on, and the images up here are just development work for that. So they are completely handmade. They're work in mixed media, and I'm trying something slightly different here, but always I've tended to kind of mock images up in some way. It might be in Photoshop, it might be by hand, but it's kind of, there isn't a set process I have for doing this. And I think one of the things I try and avoid is having a very, very set idea of how I want it to look at the end, because I kind of think I want the process to have its own part in this. I want to kind of let it tell me what to do, if that makes sense. So I'll generally start off with ideas. What I'm going to do with these ones is essentially work out what I like and see if I can model that process. So these are very intuitive. There's not really much of a kind of master plan going on with these at the moment. But what I'm trying to do is to look for patterns in the way that I've done them, and then develop, if you like, rules from those patterns, those things that happen in composition or color or whatever, and put those into the code. And normally that's, in a general sense, that's fairly typical. I'll maybe start with some idea of how I might put stuff together, or I'll start with some handmade work, and they kind of go hand in hand. I don't make all the library and then do all the code. It's very much, I'm doing both in tandem. And if the library suggest, I regularly scrap big chunks of code or do a bit for the library that think, actually, that's not right for this. I'm just going to drop that. So it's a very kind of, I suppose, experimental developmental process. And I'm really not trying to kind of move towards something specific. I want the artwork to surprise me and to achieve hopefully something that is giving it and the process room to breathe, and it's suggesting to me what to do.
So it's a very responsive dance. So as much as you're not using AI, and a lot of this is coming from yourself in that you're making the code, you're making the library out of the pieces, something physical that you use mixed media for, you in effect are doing the developmental process the same way that AI tries to work things out. So you are your own AI. You are the human computer.
It's not A, and I'm not sure how I it is. But I suppose what I'm trying to do is I've been making images, one thing or another, for a really long time now. And I think there's a kind of tacit knowledge I've got for that process that when I'm doing stuff by hand, I'm in a sense, I'm trying to always get to this point where the image is telling me what to do. And what I'm trying to do is to find a way of doing that with code as well, so that the code, it has got not quite a life of its own, but it's working in that kind of intuitive way. I find it quite hard to articulate this, but I suppose it's essentially about trying to kind of just let the artwork figure out for itself what it's doing, but I'm trying to set up the conditions, like a play space or a area that can happen in, and I'm putting all the kind of ingredients in, and I'm setting the kind of space that it can operate in, and hoping that something good comes out at the end.
And kind of always going back and tweaking, like you showed us in the third image. So after you'd shown us the grid and then the simple colour with the 4, you said at the top, this is where I'm looking at a basic composition, and then I feed the artwork. And is that like, I've made some code and now I'm looking at the library and I'm seeing how that's working, and I want more of this and less of that. And you start, you just, am I right in thinking it is that back and forth of feedback,
Absolutely.
and modification, and so you're developing with the art?
Yes, that's exactly it. I think that process, and I've even got very often I'll not look at it. I'll deliberately, I'll go and look at another image, or I'll do something else a bit. I very often find that the kind of that first glimpse of something tells you what you need to know about it. And if you stare at it for too long, you kind of lose the ability to do that. Very often I leave my code running overnight, so I'll come down into the studio in the morning, and over a cup of coffee or whatever, I'll be kind of looking at what's appeared in the night. And I very often make the best decisions when I'm coming at it fresh. I find that the more I look at it, the harder it is to decide what's working or what's not working about it.
I can believe that when I'm looking at images and what to develop with my photography, that set of fresh eyes, the amount of times that, right, take a step away, leave it, come back fresh, and you suddenly see it completely differently. And it gives that energy. And as you say, there's that initial gut reaction, which is so often right. I've had to learn to trust my gut. Do you find that you are quite instinctive and have learned that your gut is quite huge in the process?
Yes, I've got a huge gut. It's something that I think I've got to say like an old git here, but as you get older, I think you realise more and more. I think I kind of probably am getting more instinctive about the way I make work. That's not so I don't probably overthink everything as well, but I think I'm aware that actually very often that gut instinct, that going with how you feel, is often the best response. And I think it's giving yourself space to do that. So if you thought a lot about the space that you're working in, the space that the code's working in, then hopefully when you get into that space, then you can really let instinct take over. So it's a kind of building something very carefully, very thoughtfully, but then acting intuitively and instinctively within it. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Perfect sense, yes. So final question, because this has been so fascinating, the time has just wished by. I would love to know, if people come to visit you,
Yes.
at Chester Art Beat on the 5th to the 7th of July. And you're in the,
Clarendon Art Gallery.
Yeah, which is on St. Michael's Row, isn't it?
That's it. Yes.
People come to find you there. What can they expect in terms of, are they just going to be looking at prints like you have behind you?
Yeah.
Or is there going to be some element of work happening and development process in situ? How are you setting yourself up this time?
So there will be prints there, but I'm going to be doing two things. First of all, I'm going to be just drawing work that will become part of an image library. But also, if people want to have a go at making their own generative work, I'm going to write a little program that allows people to do a really simple sketch, and it's not going to be remotely judgmental. It can be anything you like, a little scribble or whatever, that I will then photograph and feed into some code, and the code will turn that into some generative art. So people will get the opportunity to kind of see how something that they've created can become something that is an image, a piece of generative art at the end. I did something similar when I was at the last Chester Art Beat, and I found it was quite funny. I found kids were absolutely willing to have a go at it, adults less so. So I'm hoping to entice a few more grown-ups to have a go this time, but anyone's welcome. And it's more just an opportunity to kind of play with the technology and see what happens with when you feed something that you've created yourself into some code.
Okay, so that is your call. When you come visit Alex, be prepared to create some art and be explorative. Let your creative juices flow and get past those adult inhibitions. Is it? Be
Inhibitions. Yes.
Become uninhibited like a child, because they create fabulous artwork because they're not yet in that place where they think I can't, or
Absolutely.
can I put myself out there? And one thing I would love to just share quickly is Alex does have a website, as well as finding him on the socials. You can visit him here at alexrussell.com. And on there is some information about the series, and also he has a shop. So if for any reason you are unable to make it to Chester Art Beat and the prints and so forth, then there is all of this fabulous, I love this, the sea with the waves. It feels like when I was a child and they created sets to do drama and plays on.
Yes.
Was it sort of like Pirates of Penzance? It might have been, and they made some sea in front,
yes,
and it just
yes.
memory. It's amazing how visual arts can take you back in your mind.
Yes. Yeah. No, I love the way that people read all sorts of different stuff into it as well. I really like that people see loads and loads of different things in the work, which is great.
Oh, and what I didn't give you opportunity to do, we were talking just before we jumped on, that you have been creating a new series, and this will only have been seen in one location prior to Chester Art Beat. So if you want to know more, then you're going to have to, as time is now up, come and visit Alex in Clarendon Fine Art, somewhere between the 5th and the 7th, and I'm sure he will happily showcase and explain and answer any questions that you have about his existing work, his process, and have a go, step in. So thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate your time, and we will see you soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you.